A great deal of respect for Pedro Noguero's work, and you're going to see some intersections between this and Pedro's work, and I'm hoping that this will, in a sense, address some of the next questions that come up once we understand the kinds of scholarship that Dr. Noguero is familiar with and presents. I'm going to start just with, I like this little slide simply because all those little dots on the left-hand side are my students who are now principals of Chicago schools. I've put over 100, my program has put over 100 principals in Chicago public schools over the last decade, and they're having a really profound impact on student learning. And what I'm going to talk about today is what it is to have a theory of action that actually makes a difference, okay? And use a couple of examples from our work in Chicago. I want to start with a kind of a systems theory perspective. This is a quote that many of you have heard at one time or another. Your system, any system, is perfectly designed to obtain the results you are obtaining. This is one of those famous quotes that nobody knows who first said it. And if you read the Carr article there, she talks about how this is an untraceable quote. We don't know who first said this, but it's true anyway, right? I mean, the reason we get the same results for low-income kids and minority kids in this country year in and year out with very little change is our system is set up to produce exactly that. Now, nobody said, let's make a school system that will disadvantage low-income kids. That kind of intentionality isn't necessary. The point is the system became what it became, and right now, unless that system is disrupted, we'll get the same results next year and the year after and a decade from now. So the challenge to us as educators is, how do you disrupt that system that thoroughly produces and regularly produces the results that we get? Are you guys getting, is this sound okay for you? Because I'm getting a little bit of feedback, but you're okay with it. Okay, good. So to obtain significantly improved results from our schools, a significantly improved, and that means disrupted system is necessary. And so one of the questions is, do we think our work is going to disrupt this system? Because if it's not, we're going to get the same results we got, right? So then we have to think about, well, what's your theory for how you would disrupt it? What's your theory of impact or your theory of action for how you could disrupt a system that regularly and reliably produces the inequalities that Pedro Noguero talked about? But wait a minute. Who says your job is to disrupt the system? Isn't it enough just to be a good teacher, really? I mean, who signed you up as social change agent anyway? That's not what your certificate says. Your certificate says that you're qualified to teach. So I want to take a moment to think about that for just a second. I want to say that there are three legitimate motives for becoming a teacher, and everybody in this room shares some of this, right? One of them is just make a living. I mean, look, we got to make a living. And making a living as a teacher, even if you're not going to be Mr. or Mrs. Social Justice, making a living as a teacher is a perfectly legitimate pursuit in life. Now, some people have chosen to make a living as a teacher for the second reason, because they want to make a difference in people's lives. For example, maybe you could have made more as an insurance salesman, and in your view, that's not making the difference I want to make. I'd rather make a difference in the lives of kids that might actually affect their futures in some important ways. And so many of you in here are motivated by that second thing. A lot of people go into teaching because they think they're going to make a better world. And this is one of the things that actually causes people to quit teaching sometimes. They go into teaching because they think, I'm an agent of social justice and I'm going to end capitalism as we know it. You know, I'm going to turn this racist country around by being a second-grade teacher. It turns out that that's not a very good theory of action, right? Even really good second-grade teachers don't turn this country around in the systemic problems that it has. So one of the things to think about is what can you really accomplish as a teacher, and how do you need to think about that in terms of what you can accomplish? The reason I quote social justice education, you know, we can chuckle about this, but there are actually books out with titles by famous authors called Teaching to Change the World, right? Jeannie Oakes' book. Or John Rory's book, Teaching for Social Change. And the question is, can you really do that as a teacher? Can you really change the world? And you can say, well, I changed one kid, that changes the world. Yeah, that's not what we're talking about necessarily when you're thinking about genuine social change, right? So there's a kind of a dilemma here, because most people in here would like to see a better world, would like to see a more fair world, but how does your teaching actually serve that? Does your theory of action, and one of the things that's important to recognize here is your theory of action for getting and holding a job is a very different theory of action for changing social inequalities, right? So if you think by having a good idea, I'm going to get a job and hold that job, that will change America, that's probably not so, right? So the question is, what kind of theory would you have to actually make a dent in the very inequalities that you've been talking about at this conference? I'm going to talk about the fact that the notion of change agency is something that evolves in different people over time. When I went to graduate school, when I signed up to be a doctoral student here at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, one of the big motivators for me was to get a better job than what I was doing. I wanted a doctorate because I was getting tired of being a roofer. I was getting tired of building fences. These were things I did in my spare time as a teacher. And I thought, geez, you know, part of the motivation here is to get credentials to rise in the field, and that's affected all of us. The number one reason that college kids go to college in America, Sandy Aston from UCLA has done this study every year for years. What do you suppose the number one reason for college kids to go to college is? To get a better job, right? We all know how this works, right? But what happens is that there are some teachers, and you know some teachers like this, not many, far fewer than people sometimes portray. There are some teachers who are only about that, who are only about keeping their job. Do you guys ever read Dilbert in the paper? There's a character in Dilbert, Wally. Wally's purpose in life is to do as little as possible but not lose his job, right? There are, yeah, people raising their hand. That would be me, you know. So there are folks like that. Our experience in working in hundreds of Chicago schools is there aren't many teachers like that. That teachers, by and large, actually want to do well for the kids. They want to serve the kids well. And that opens up the second door. How do you continually get better at that? There's nobody, if I asked you guys, raise your hand if you're reaching 100% of the kids and bringing them in your classes and bringing them to the levels that they're capable of, nobody's hand goes up. Because you're all conscious of those kids you're not really reaching enough yet. In other words, becoming really good at your craft in teaching is a lifelong challenge. You never get good enough, right? So that's thoroughly ethical also, to say, look, what I'm about is continually getting better to serve the purposes of my job. But how do you go from there to actually changing the inequalities of schools? One of the things that's instructive here is a really good remark by Keegan and Leahy, a couple of Harvard researchers who study why people don't change. By the way, raise your hand if you've ever tried to change something about yourself and failed. Yeah. Okay, now go back to your school, and you were motivated to change, right? Now go back to your school and change all the teachers' practices in your school and see how well that works for you, when some of them aren't particularly motivated to change practices. Institutional change is really, really hard. Just changing one thing about yourself is really hard. Institutional change is very difficult. It can be done, and we know a lot about how to do it. But one of the things that you find is, Keegan and Leahy point out, that sometimes you just want to do your job better, and you find out the institution you're working in doesn't really let you, that it's throwing roadblocks in your way. And this is what leads some teachers to get very activist. So they become teacher leaders, rough definition, folks who are willing and able to take responsibility for school outcomes outside their own classroom. Just honestly, how many of you have entered into a stage of your career where you would say that you fit that definition? Willing and able to take responsibility for school outcomes outside your own classroom. Let's see hands. Some degree. That's a kind of a good thumbnail definition of teacher leadership. It's critical that you master the craft of teaching, but it's also critical, as we'll look and see here, that you become part of a group of teachers that actually has an impact on the culture of the school if you want to make a difference. So the importance of collective action is critical here. We currently, mostly in the US, have a version of teaching as privatized practice. You go into your school, you close the door, and what you do is very different from the teacher next to you, in most places. This is the dominant model for American public schooling. Yet, if you're serious about teaching for social justice, that requires addressing the locus of injustice, which is institutional. It's not the teacher next door that is the source of injustice. It is how the institution itself works. And you won't get at that just by being really good in your classroom. So the question is, what kind of steps do you need to take if you're going to be a change agent who actually moves the school as the unit of change, for example? Because when the school as a unit of change moves, it has a profound impact on all kids. Collective action is necessary, and even teacher leadership, or even a good school principal, believes in collective action. The first thing we teach our principals in our program, and it's the single most awarded program in the country, the first thing we teach our principals is they cannot do this themselves. That if they're going to move this school, if they're going to move this low-income, low-performing school, they're going to have to enlist as many teachers in as many leadership roles as possible because it's going to take a lot of leadership to move the school. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about a scholarship of demonstration. Henry Giroux and Paulo Freire, who actually worked together, and Paulo Freire visited. We hosted Paulo Freire here in the late 70s, early 80s, if you recall. And at that time, Freire was saying, look, this language of critique, how many of you have read something about Freire? How many of you? Yeah. You know, and he was saying, look, this language of criticism, the language of critique isn't enough. We need to have a language of possibility. And so he and Henry Giroux would write about this in the 80s, about the need for a language of possibility. I quickly concluded that a language of possibility is not enough. We need to see a scholarship of demonstration. We need to see it being done, right? And going clear back to 77, Ron Edmonds said the following. Edmonds was at Harvard. He was the lead driver in the kind of effective schools research. And Edmonds said, how many schools do you need to see in which low-income children are performing at high academic levels before you believe that all such children are capable of such performance? And he went on to say, I suggest if you need to see more than one such school, you have your own reasons for believing poor children can't learn. I don't know why that quote stuck with me, but it has, right? If you need to see more than one such example, I suggest you have your own reasons for believing poor. And yet, as a state, we're pretty comfortable as a state where socioeconomic status to this moment is the chief determinant of student learning outcomes in Illinois. And even in a school that does well, like the school my kids went to in Oak Park River Forest, even in a school that's noted as one of the stronger high schools, if you are black and poor, you are almost guaranteed to be in the bottom half of the class there. Almost guaranteed. It's not because teachers decided that they're going to do a bad job for poor black kids. There's other institutional things operating socially and within the school, and as it turns out, the school can make a difference despite the social context. So I'm going to talk about the importance of a scholarship of demonstration. I'm assuming in the back you can't really read this, so I'm using this so you can see an example. I have 70 slides like this for 70 principals currently working in Chicago. My principals are also in Denver, and they're in Dominican Republic, and they're in New York and elsewhere. But I have 70 slides for the Chicago principals, and every slide starts with demographics. I want to just see if I've got, oh look, I've got a little thing here. So that, for example, here's Clemente High School, which has been on academic probation for 19 years, all right? 724 kids, 96% low income. Diverse learners is the language the state is now using for special ed kids, right? 22% special ed. ELL, English language. Hispanic, 73%. There's 2% white kids in the school, the rest are black. In the 3 years that she's been there, this particular principal removed the school from academic probation because of student performance increases, has now 89% or higher of freshmen on track rates for 3 consecutive years. One of the greatest predictors of school dropout in high schools is whether freshmen are failing courses or not. Freshmen who failed in more than one course have more than a 50% chance of dropping out by the time before they graduate. So we track freshmen on track. 89% of her kids, that's a record for Clemente. Increased attendance rates by 13%, decreased the dropout rate from 18% to 2%. This is one of the poorest high schools in the city, has 19 years on probation. She increased the graduation rate from 49% to 79% in 3 years. Now, I'm starting with this one to say, we've got lots and lots of slides like this, and we're only going to look at one, but I'm going to show you some other kinds of data as well. For us, it's important to see that it can be done and to see who's doing it, where it's being done, and how. These kids are capable. How many of you have ever heard of urban prep? You heard of urban prep? It gets a lot of publicity each year because 100% of these young African-American males who graduate from urban prep charter school go to college every year. What they don't tell you is there's a 45% dropout from freshman to senior year. In that same building as urban prep, one of my principals at Team Englewood, it's the 3rd UIC principal in that school, that school has 95 to 100% graduation rate, almost 100% college attendance rate of those who graduate, and the dropout rate over the 4-year period is less than 20%. This is a school that's performing at a far higher level than the school that's getting the publicity because the charter machine is inviting that kind of publicity, right? So one message is we got to get better at getting our message out. But the point is that's a neighborhood school. It has to take every kid from the neighborhood that's in Englewood, 100% African American and virtually 100% low income, and these kids are going to college. All right? Dropout rate is low. Now, let me go on and remind you of the entire history of scholarship that Bill Trent and I have been exposed to for our entire careers, okay? Here it is, the entire history of school research in one slide. In the 1960s, we learned that socioeconomic status is the prime contributor to student learning outcomes. Hey, Bill, is there a chance that this could be posted somewhere so students could actually, teachers could have access to the thing? The entire talk will be up online. Okay, cool. Oh, that's great. Okay, good. We'll put it on yours and we'll put it on my center too. Okay, that's great. So this is kind of cool because when Bill and I were in graduate school, what we learned was not only that socioeconomic status was the prime mover for student learning, but you couldn't do anything about it. Christopher Jenks wrote a book called Inequality, and the conclusion, he said, look, the reality is there's no evidence that schools can change this. There's no evidence that schools can change the low-income learning outcomes that we're seeing. And he said, since that's so, he says in the end of his book, he and Coleman worked together at Harvard on this study. Jenks said, since that's so, let's at least make schools more pleasant places for kids and teachers to be. That was his conclusion. That was dangerous research, and it was the dominant research of its era. By 1970s, the effective schools research started to challenge that in fact, we started to notice that schools in low-income neighborhoods that were performing up here, all of them had one thing in common, which is really dedicated and motivated school leaders who understood what it takes to help teachers improve classroom practice. Because if you don't improve classroom practice, you won't get much difference in student learning outcomes. Teachers are the key. Next, 1980s, A Nation at Risk launches 30 years of teacher ed reform. The teacher beating that you continue to hear, you know, if our teachers were just more talented, we'd do better in schools, that started in the 80s with A Nation at Risk. 1990s, What Matters Most and the Quality of Classroom Instruction. For the first time, it became clear that you could dramatically improve low-income student learning with outstanding teaching. For the first time, the research became compelling and convincing. That commission was led by Linda Darling Hammond, What Matters Most. In the 2000s, however, we saw this bipartisan, really influential law, No Child Left Behind, And the trouble is, in No Child Left Behind, all the focus was on teachers. If we could just make teachers better, we'd get better. And the problem with that was it treated teachers as if they were individuals not located in organizations. There's almost nothing in the No Child Left Behind law about principals and schools as organizations. It's all about if teachers would do their jobs better, let's hold teachers more accountable, and so on. Oh, that's a shame. But, you know, it just died, Bill. This is kind of like the Academy Awards when the people running the show have decided somebody's talked long enough. They must have realized I'm just warming up here. You work on it. So, look, I'm using my teacher voice now. Back row, can you hear me okay in the back row?
Yeah.
Okay. When you can't hear me, let's see those hands go up, okay? All right, so look, 2000s, we have this massively influential bill to hold teachers more accountable for your performance. And there's no attention paid to schools as organizations within which you're working. By 2010, what some people think is the single most important reform, if Charles Payne had come here, he would have talked about this. By 2010, a book was published that I really think you guys should have on your shelves. It's called Organizing Schools for Improvement. You read this book and you become the smartest person in your building on schools as organizations. Tony Breik, Penny Sebring, and others pointed out that, hey, wait, we've got schools in Chicago. This is a 20-year study. We've got schools in Chicago in the same neighborhood, and one of them is performing here and one of them is performing here. And this is true over and over. And in fact, if you study why some of these schools perform here, even though they're all minority, all low-income kids, you start to find the same things are true of those schools over and over. How many of you have studied in your own work the 5 essential supports? How many of you districts have now used a survey of teachers to find out how your organizational capacity is developing in your school? State of Illinois is now using this statewide, but not every district is using it. And it's based on this research. And what it looks at is, what are the markers of a school that's organized for student success? And here's what they say. I'm not going to say it yet. I'm going to wait a couple slides. Yeah, I'll do it this way. One of the things that they realize is that the research on school leadership is pointing to the fact that it is second only to quality of classroom instruction among all school-related factors that affect student learning. This research is held up over the last decade. But there's actually a problem to that way of thinking. That is a statistical claim, that if you do the stats, quality of classroom instruction has a higher correlation to student learning than quality of school leadership. The trouble is, you'll never get high-quality instruction in every classroom without strong school leadership. It takes strong school leadership to make high-quality instruction a school-wide commitment and a school-wide achievement. So it turns out the second most important thing, namely school leadership, is necessary for the first most important thing, namely high-quality teaching, to take place. So, Breik and Sebring and the crew in Organizing Schools for Improvement say, hey, guess what? We have found 5 things over a 20-year period, studying almost 700 schools, that when these 5 things are present, kids in those low-income schools perform at a very high level, and when they're not present, the kids don't. In fact, they point out, if you even get 3 of these right, you have a 10 times higher chance of kids outperforming socioeconomic status predictors than if you don't get 3 of them right. So Charles Payne, who you missed, but Charles will be pleased I'm doing part of his talk for him, Charles would have said this. He would have said, hey, from my perspective, it's leadership and pick 2. Because leadership is one of the things that you have to get right, according to the research of Breik and others. If you get leadership right, what's professional capacity? Professional capacity is really about teachers having voice in making the key curricular and instruction decisions in the school and doing it collectively. You understand student-centered learning climate, you understand instructional guidance, namely, does the school actually support every new and experienced teacher in improving their practice in a steady way? Is the school committed to the improvement of practice? Because if it is not committed to the improvement of practice with systems and structures in place, we won't get improved student performance. So I'm going to give you a closer look at a theory of action here, and we're going to come back to theory of action toward the end. Our theory of action for our principals is this. The reason that I started out in teacher ed, wrote textbooks for teachers, did research on teachers, and then gradually moved to principal preparation is I became convinced that if we didn't get the principalship right, we were going to be hamstringing teachers. We were going to be limiting what teachers can do. This came as a result of a decade of work in Chicago. So, for the past 13 years, we've been operating on this theory of action. That if you want to get this where it needs to be, student engagement and learning, you are going to have to work on the quality of classroom instruction in every classroom in the school. In order to do that, you can't just say to teachers, would you please teach better already? That's not going to work. And sending them to some PDs is not going to work. What's going to work is if the school becomes a place that's committed to adult learning first and foremost. And for the school to be first and foremost committed to adult learning means that you've got to put systems and structures in place so that just showing up at work each day for you as a teacher means you are engaging in improving your professional practice. So you've got to put the organizational resources in place to support teacher growth and teacher development. We've never seen this happen without administrative leadership. Go to the Wallace Foundation website. They're the largest funders of school leadership program in the country, and they'll say the same thing. We've never seen it happen without strong leadership. This kind of developing of the organizational resources to support great teaching never bubbles up from the bottom because the principal has too much power. But if the principal's power becomes in service of adult learning, you have a very different picture. So let me zip through a few slides kind of quickly, just give you a sense of what this has resulted in our work, and then come back to teaching. If the theory is that you need strong leadership to develop organizational capacity, that is to say systems and structures in the school that improve teacher learning, that's how you get improved student learning. What we've done now for the last 12, 13 years now, we're in our 13th cohort, is prepare and develop principals who lead the improvement of student learning as a rule rather than a rare exception. That's our challenge, and we're not there. We're not at 100% yet. Not 100% of our principals are dramatically improving student learning in their schools, but a very high percentage of them are. When the principals don't do that in our program, that's a problem, right? But interestingly enough, predicting talent and selecting talent is not easy. The National Football League invests enormous amount of money in getting data for each and every draft candidate that they add for their teams, right? I mean, they really pull out all stops to investigate whether that college junior or senior is going to be a great football player, and they get it wrong half the time. Now, we get it right about 80% of the time. I gave this talk to Wallace Foundation, not this talk, I gave a talk about our selection process to Wallace Foundation recently, and one of the businessmen in the room on their board said, could you just send us your recipe for that? Because he said, we're not succeeding 80% of the time in my business, and we'd like to see what you're doing. Well, the reason we can do that is because the truth is, we have a lot more insight into what it takes to make a school successful, largely because of the kind of research that gets done on this, then we have insight into what makes a business successful. A really accomplished business leader just took over JCPenney 2 years ago and almost drove it completely into the ground. He was a complete slam dunk of a successful business leader, and he was a complete failure at JCPenney. There are just more variables when you're operating on that scale. The scale of a school is a variable that we can deal with. By the way, speaking of scale, If we wanted to put a highly trained principal in every single school for every vacancy in Illinois, every year, fill every vacancy with somebody out of a program like mine, that would only take 400 principals a year. That's half the size of my high school class. The budget required to do that is a rounding, according to the Illinois State Business Roundtable, a rounding error on the state education budget. In other words, there's a theory of action here for changing schools that I'm sharing with you to try to stimulate more theorizing about theories of action today. So, you've seen enough of that one. What are the results? As of last year, we've got another batch just graduating. Out of 148 completers of our residency, our full year, we have a full year paid residency. Everybody that goes through our program spends a full year as an assistant principal in a Chicago public school and gets paid an administrative salary for doing that. That's part of the program, right? It's like student teaching on steroids, basically, is what it is. And so what we have is 99% placement. After 11 years, 99% of them got administrative positions, most of them as principals, and it's the highest eligibility. If one of you wanted to apply to be a principal in CPS, you'd have to take their eligibility assessment. CPS, 20 years ago, Chicago Public Schools, got a state law passed that says that the principal endorsement is not enough to be a principal in Chicago. You have to pass their bar exam. Their bar exam has a 64% failure rate. Right? And we have over a 90% success rate on that bar exam. I'm not saying that to say, oh, look how good we are. I'm saying, as a field, this is what we're capable of doing once we decide to do it. Here's a school, Morton Elementary. I want to give you just a few quickie examples of things that our principals are doing. Here's a school that is like, what, 95% African American, a slight slice of Hispanic kids in there. And this was, 5 years ago, it was the #2 worst performing school in Chicago. I see people smiling. Did somebody attend Morton as a kid? Yeah. Okay, so it was at the bottom of the barrel in Chicago in terms of student performance. Look what happened after our principals took over the school at about this point. We've had 2 consecutive principals. You can't read this too well, so I'm going to just say a few things. This tells you what % of the Morton children were scoring on standardized test scores that would make them on track for college readiness by the time they got to high school. It was 3.3%. After a couple of our principals were there, 37% of the kids were on track for college readiness. And this took place between the years of 2009 and 2014. This is a 5-year transformation of this school. Same neighborhood didn't change. And this is non-selective. You have to take every kid in the neighborhood who shows up, okay? And this is virtually all black, virtually all low income. And so what you see is that pink area there, that's the % of kids who were in the bottom quartile of the entire state. 70%, and a lot of Chicago schools look like this, by the way. 70% of the kids were in the bottom quartile of the entire state on the ISAT test. By the end of the 5-year period, in fact, when our person took over, 75%, by the end of it, only a quarter of the kids in the school are in the bottom quartile in the state. This is dramatically changing a school and a school culture, right? And there's 2 principals in a row who did this. And so it's not like one genius principal, right? It was one really good principal followed by one really good principal. And when principals know what they're doing and know how to support teachers, because teaching is the silver bullet here, high quality instruction is what has to happen. The other thing you see here is, well, let's go back. The other thing you see on this one is down here, what's that green line there? Oh, what's that one right there? Nah, that's just % meets and exceeds, which is a bogus measure anyway. This one's good. This is a good measure right here. What's the % of their kids who's at or above state averages? Basically, what's the % of Morton kids who are at grade level, right? 6.8 when we started. After 5 years, almost half the school is at grade level. This has a profound impact on these kids' lives and futures. And it's school-wide. It's not in one classroom. This is all the classrooms in the school, and some classrooms are doing better than that. All right, let's look at another example. Fulton Elementary on the south side. Morton was a west side school. This is south side school. Here's a school that was largely black and Hispanic. As you can see, almost 38% Hispanic, the rest black, all low income. Interestingly, this neighborhood that Fulton was in had the highest foreclosure rate of any neighborhood in Illinois. In other words, they basically closed down the houses in that neighborhood because of the recession, right? People just couldn't afford to pay. So this was terrible mobility during this time. You know, at the end of the year, she had half the kids different than she had at the beginning of the year. And so her results are not as off the charts dramatic. But look, she takes over in what, 2009? By 2014, the percent of kids who are on track for ACT scores that would be on track for college goes from 5% to 20%. If you look at the kids that are at the state average, 8% at grade level when she takes over, 30% by the time she's done, 71% of the kids in the bottom quartile of the state down to less than half. All right, so this isn't about magic. It's about long, slow, hard work for transforming schools. If your theory of change were to put this kind of principle in every low-performing school, so when this person leaves, there's another one waiting, I don't know of a faster or more cost-effective way to guarantee a better education for low-income kids. There is no theory that's better than that right now, all right? But it hangs on quality of classroom instruction. Here's a high school. We've got 20 high schools in Chicago right now. That's larger than any high school district in the state. There's no district in the state with anywhere near that many high schools in it. And of those 20 high schools, I'll show you some aggregate data. Kennedy, 2 out of the last 3 years, Kennedy got more than 1 full point increase on the ACT score, which is very difficult to pull off. And here you have a school that's largely Hispanic. And here what you see in Kennedy is our principal and our assistant principal took over in 2010, and you see this dramatic increase at first, a fall off, and then another dramatic increase in 2014. You can't